As we keep talking through the membership class and thinking through the beliefs of the church, we have two different sections in our Constitution regarding our beliefs. We just finished what we call our Statement of Faith, and those are our doctrines that are really, it's essential to be in agreement together on those doctrines to be a member of the church. And as I've said, I'll just quickly remind you, it doesn't necessarily mean that you can say, yes, I affirm all of this, but that there's nothing in that you would say, no, I don't agree with that. So there may be things that you're not familiar with, or things that you've not thought through, or maybe things you're still working through. And you say, I don't know where I am on that. So you don't necessarily have to be able to positively state, yes, I believe all of this, but we do ask that you not negatively state, I disagree with this particular aspect. The next section is a little bit of a confusing mix as far as it goes with that, because we cover some things that are absolutely essential for agreement to be members of the church, and then there's things that are in there that are not necessarily that way. So, for example, first article we're going to talk about is creation. I absolutely believe and teach a young earth creation. And so I would in fact tend more towards the younger side of the young earth creation, so that I would say that the earth is around 6,000 years old, and give or take a few hundred years maybe. And that's what this section of our Constitution states, is that the earth is a young earth. But if somebody says, I don't know that I completely agree with the 6,000 to 10,000 years, maybe the earth is 100,000 years old or 250,000 years old. If we don't actually require complete agreement there for you to be a member. Now, in those things related to this, and I'll try to spell some of those out as we, which ones really matter and which ones matter, but you don't have to agree with us on. I'll try to distinguish there as we go through, but as we do ask, if there anything in this that you say, I'm really not in agreement on that particular aspect, even if it's something that you still join the church despite that difference, we do ask that you respect the church's teachings on that, and particularly to the extent of not trying to teach something else or change people's opinions on those issues. And so these are in their own section, and they're called the Christian ethics section, because it primarily are addressing issues that are very contemporary issues, things that we are really wrestling with right now in our culture. And so they are things like creation, gender, sexuality, abortion, euthanasia, those kinds of issues that are very much hot button issues in our culture right now. And so this is where we have spelled out where we are on those various things. And it does begin, as I said, with creation. And so that, Genesis chapter 1, if you read through it, so I'm not going to read all of it this morning, but if you read through it, we find the declaration that God created everything in 6 days. And again, I do believe that is 6 literal days, as recorded in Genesis chapter 1, so they're not long periods of time. It's not a poetic framework to describe creation, but it's an actual, on day 1, God actually created light, and that was an actual, more or less, 24-hour period of time. On day 6, in this similar 24-hour period of time, God created all the animals, Adam and Eve, and so that you have a week that he did all of that creation in. And again, there's room for some differences, even though I'd argue very strongly against other understandings there. But one of the things that is essential with this is we understand that this is God's active working. God created everything. And so you cannot say, well, I believe it all just evolved without God. There's not room to say there is no creator. or that God was not involved in the process of creation and actively involved in the process of creation. It said these chapters really are foundational to our understanding of the rest of Scriptures. God actively sustains the world so that He is the one holding it all together. And so that part of what this means is that the world is going to continue until God says it's time to destroy it. And so that, yes, man can do harm to it, but we are not ultimately going to destroy the earth. We are not going to even render it unfit for human habitation. Rather, we see the Bible laying out a different plan and different promises there. That God created everything perfect. That's at Genesis 1:31 when He looked at creation and He said it was all very good. God saw everything that He had made, and indeed it was very good. It was perfect. It was very good in accord with the standards of the perfect and holy God, so that all was exactly as He intended it. There was no sin, there was no suffering, there was no death, but it was perfect. And then man sinned. That's Genesis chapter 3. And as a result of man's sin, that's where suffering and death came into creation. So now we look around the world and we struggle to sometimes with what's going on. Why is it so bad? How could God, some people ask, how could good God create such a death-filled, suffering-filled universe? And to which the biblical response is He did not. He created a perfect universe and man sinned and brought the world under the curse. And related to that is environmentalism. This is something that we're really not actively involved in any way as a church, except to simply say that God did give man dominion. Psalm 115, particularly, it tells us that dominion of man continues. In Psalm chapter 8, we see the 8th Psalm, we see the same thing, that the dominion of man continues in the world. So yes, man sinned, and by his sin, he damaged his relationship with the world, but man did not lose that responsibility over the world. And the key thing, one of the things that we stress with this, and why it's even in our Constitution, is that man is different from all other created beings. So that man is not just a more advanced ape. We're not just another animal. You cannot say, for example, meat is murder. Because, and I don't care about whether you're a vegetarian or not, that's not the issue. Murder is what happens when you kill a human being. And we cannot equate humans with bacon. Bacons are delicious. And so you can't confuse the two. There's a definite distinction between man and the rest of the created order. And all other created beings are animals. Man is uniquely created in the image of God. And then we go to Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 and 27. And these are, of course, a huge issue right now. As God says, let us make man in our image, according to our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So God created man in His own image. In the image of God, He created him, male and female, He created them. And so now we have these questions of gender and sexuality. As I said, these are huge issues right now. What the Bible affirms is that God created man with two genders. God created male and female. They're both created in the image of God. Every woman is the image bearer of God. Every man is the image bearer of God. And these are biologically determined. They are not interchangeable. They are not changeable in any way, which honestly, anybody that knows anything about biology recognizes it is not possible to change a male to a female. It doesn't happen because there is genetic stuff going on at the very molecular level that affects everything. And so if you change a few externals, you have not changed anything. And all of this is tied into the original creation, God creating man with these two genders and only two genders. And all attempts to change gender or its appearance of gender are forbidden by God. We see this particularly in the Old Testament law, but you see those Old Testament laws becoming a foundation for the New Testament teachings about sexuality. That they're not interchangeable. They are distinct. They are to be kept distinct. And so, what the Old Testament primarily forbids is what we would call today cross-dressing. But I think it's certainly the principles then apply to everything above that. If I cannot dress to look like a woman, I certainly should not go take some surgical route to try to look like a woman. It's completely forbidden by God. And again, founded in these distinctions there. And then with that, the use of pronouns contrary to one's birth gender is improper for a Christian. And so that if someone comes in, very obviously a guy, and says, my preferred pronoun is she and her, or some other thing that's clearly not what he is, it is improper to call him something that is contrary to what he is. And so that, and we argue that it's improper because now you're actually participating in a lie. Pronouns are gendered, at least in English. They communicate something very definite. And so when I say, look at her, there is a very definite expectation of what her is going to be. And her is not going to be male. And so, now the way we've tried to carefully word this in our statement so that we as a church, and particularly those who are in leadership roles in any church function, we are not going to knowingly use a pronoun contrary to someone's gender. Now, certainly, it probably will inadvertently happen. We are not going to engage in calling someone a wrong pronoun. I know there are those who are in different job positions where in their job, their employer is saying, you have to use preferred pronouns. And I would still say Christians shouldn't, and I would encourage you not to, but at the same time, we are not trying to mandate to the individual, you have to speak in this way at your job or in some other setting. We are saying in the church setting. And so we have actually narrowly focused that particular statement. Say in the church setting, those who are in leadership in the different functions of the church are not going to knowingly use these pronouns that are contrary to a person's gender. Christ-like compassion must characterize all Christian interactions. And so we do not get to mistreat someone, whether verbally or physically, because they present themselves in a manner that we know is not according to their biological sex. We do not get to abuse, we do not get to scorn, we do not get to scoff at. We must respond to them with Christ-like compassion. So if somebody comes in and it's a dude very definitely wearing a dress, he is welcome to attend. And I mean that. We're not going to meet him at the front door and say, don't come in here. He's welcome to attend. We're going to seek to minister to him. And so that there must be Christ-like love driving all of that. So we also have God establishing unique characteristics and roles for each gender so that we have distinct roles in the home, distinct roles in the church, primarily and related to each gender. So the wives are created as a helper suitable for the husband. She is to submit herself to the husband as to the Lord. Husband is to love the wife as Christ loved the church. And so that we have the two very distinct roles within the home. We also have very definitely within the church, and again, that's our primary focus in this, as we're talking about it, is that they are distinct roles within the church, so that that the Bible forbids women from being pastors. For example, and the way that we apply that here is that we do not allow a woman to teach in the general service, in a service like this, or the morning service, where there is just a general gathering of the church. And certainly, there are many avenues in which women can teach and teach in group settings. We do not. We limit, I would say, platform ministry, so that the reading of scriptures, the public prayers are limited to the men and specifically to the male members of the church. We do not have deaconesses, so we see a distinction there within the church, so that this is a functional distinction. There is no suggestion of some sort of superiority. It's not a question of who's a better teacher. I think my wife is a phenomenal teacher. I think she's a better teacher than I am. But she's never going to teach this adult Sunday school class. And it's not a question of who's better. It's a question of what's the biblical pattern established. Again, the spiritual equality is not at all a suggestion that one is inferior in any way, but rather it is the biblical pattern that is established that we are seeking to follow. At creation, God designed and defined marriage. One man and one woman united for life. We see that Genesis chapter 2, God creating this helper fit for Adam. And we see at the end of Genesis chapter 2, therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and they two shall become one flesh. And then Jesus in Mark chapter 9 quotes this. He points back to this and says, this is the standard by which marriage is defined. So now as we come to, again, the very modern questions of who can get married, the Bible gives a very clear answer. It establishes the marriage of Adam and Eve as the pattern on which every other marriage should follow. So that what happened in the Garden of Eden is it should happen in every other marriage. That there should be that permanent union of one man and one woman. So there's certainly not any sort of polygamous relationships or polyamory and all of those things. Obviously, the man marrying a man and then the various variations they have that seem to be popular or becoming popular are forbidden by scriptures. Likewise, the ridiculous things that are going on right now with people marrying, somebody married a bridge, somebody married a building, somebody, of course, married themselves. And that's not marriage. The biblical pattern is very clear. One man and one woman united for life. So that God disapproves of divorce, but it is permitted. It's never required in Scripture, but it is permitted in the cases of adultery or desertion. And I'm not going to delve into all that, in the ins and outs of that, but we do emphasize that marriage is to be preserved as much as possible. It is to be preserved. But in that, we also recognize that if someone has been divorced, that it does not immediately lock them into a substandard position, that now they are no longer fully Christians, they have committed some sort of sin that cannot ever be fully forgiven on earth, and that therefore they can never serve in any capacity. Now, divorce may limit certain areas of service. For example, I would argue that a divorced man, particularly someone who was divorced after his salvation, probably should not be a pastor. But otherwise, though, that we say that divorce does not, in and of itself, restrict someone from service, from membership in the church, from a healthy, growing Christian life and the ministry that should accompany it. And so it is disapproved of, but it's not unforgivable. When we get to now, we come to really the value of the individual. We are created in the image of God. And so when we're talking about abortion or euthanasia, we're talking about the fact that every person is created in the image of God and is to be treated in a manner appropriate to such a creation. And so this principle of the image bearing of God actually moves beyond, and it starts a whole lot earlier than life and death issues. Because we bear the image of God, James 3 teaches us that we should not curse another person. I should not speak of someone because that person should not speak ill of someone because that person was created in the likeness of God. And by my defaming that individual, I am defaming the image bearer of God. I am essentially throwing mud on a picture of God. That's the attitude that we have to have. And when we start there, that naturally then moves towards a biblical response in questions of either death before birth or death at the very end of life. And so when it comes to abortion, we clearly affirm life begins at conception, and so that all procedures which intentionally destroy a fertilized egg or its resulting development are murder. So that it just, at the moment of conception, and to being very clear of that, because there's some attempts to redefine conception. And so at the moment of fertilization, that is now a new creature. And we see this from the Psalms, particularly, and David says, "In sin my mother conceived me." And so that what he is saying is, I was guilty. At the moment of conception, I was a guilty sinner. What that means is at the moment of conception, there was a soul accountable to God. A unique soul accountable to God. That David sprang into existence. I have no idea how the spiritual side of that works. But that David sprang into existence at the moment of conception. And therefore, any intentional destruction of that, I'll say, product of conception. I don't like the phrase, but it communicates well enough. Any intentional destruction of that is the taking of a human life. It is murder. On the other end of the spectrum, we come to questions of euthanasia, which and then we recognize that the willful taking of somebody's life is murder, but also the refusal to provide the reasonable care to protect or sustain life. And I know this is an area where it gets complex, and I'm fully aware that end-of-life issues are very, very complicated. And so we're giving a biblical principle, but it's something that we also, I also recognize in different situations there's going to be different responses to the end of life. And so part of what we understand with this, especially as Christians, is we do not cling to life at any and all costs. So we do not necessarily have to take every possible means of treatment that's out there. So cancer is probably the easiest example for that. And if somebody is diagnosed with a terminal cancer and is told you have 3 months to live, but if you take chemo, we can probably extend that to a year. This does not mean that the person is therefore biblically obligated to take chemo to extend their life by those however many months. If someone says, "No, I want to basically live my life, the rest of my life without all those drugs in my system," there's not going to be a process, any kind of a church discipline process, where we come alongside them and say, "You need to go take chemo." There's not a biblical call to do everything we possibly can to grab every second of life and extend it as long as possible. Rather, we are, because it is valuable, we do not cut it short, we do not cut it off, And we certainly do not withhold those basic things which are essential for life, food, water. We don't withhold those things. Ultimately, what that becomes is a means to cut life short, to end it more quickly rather than to let it come to its own conclusion. And that would be the distinction. Again, that's one of those areas where it is such a complex thing, and there's so many factors that come into play in any of those decisions that it really, the basic principle is true, and it must be upheld, and yet how it's worked out is often a matter of the family's conscience. And I personally try to be incredibly respectful of those end-of-life decisions, whatever they are, because it is such a complex thing. Very quickly, our relationship to the state, the church, and this is one that is vitally important, and we saw this with the pandemic. Why it is so important. The church and human governments are two distinct, God-ordained entities which should not seek to control or coerce the other. So we absolutely reject any kind of idea of a state church. We also absolutely reject any kind of a theocratic nation. Theocratic meaning God ruled. Usually what that means is church ruled, or whatever church is in power ruled nation. We do not believe that in any way the church is entrusted with running the government, whether it be state government, local government, national government. Rather, the church is its own sphere of influence and sphere of authority that works with, alongside, and at times under the various governments, but it is still distinct from, and that there are absolutely areas of the church governance that the civil government has no authority over at all. And again, it became very apparent with the pandemic, how many civil authorities do not recognize at all this distinction, and how many church authorities do not recognize at all this distinction. And so that, and I know every state was different, so I'm just talking about what we did. Here is when the pandemic first started, we took a couple of weeks off basically to figure out what's going on, and began to meet again pretty quickly. I want to say within 3 weeks we were meeting together on Sunday morning. And in Michigan, our governor and the various laws that were laid out always provided various exceptions for churches. So it never became really an issue for us in a legal sense. And so we continued to meet for quite some time, just Sunday morning. We didn't do our lunches or Sunday school or anything else. We curtailed our meeting, but we continued to meet together because of a biblical command to forsake not the assembling of yourselves together. Again, it never became an issue in Michigan, but I know there were some that were saying in some nations were banning churches from singing together, or were trying to ban churches from singing together. And that was never an option on the table for us, because we are biblically commanded to sing when we meet together. So it's the government has no authority to speak here and say, you must not do these certain things. We did somewhat try to observe the social distancing. We spread out in the building, and we did, again, limited our meal gatherings. I don't think we gathered for a meal together until Michigan opened up its public dining policy some. And so that we tried to be respectful of the governing authorities, but at the same time saying there are certain things they have no authority over. So one of the things, some of the things we see probably coming down the road at some point, the forbidding of preaching against or saying anything against homosexuality. There is a clear biblical teaching that we must affirm. The government has no authority to tell us we can or cannot speak to that. Now, would I might be in prison for that? Yeah, I would not at all be surprised to be thrown in jail. Certainly, you expect to be fined, lose tax-exempt status, stuff like that, because of it. But we would still tell the government, you have no right to give commands in this area. We have a greater authority that we must follow. And so we understand these are two distinct, both God-ordained entities. And so we always speak respectfully of our government, so that for the Christian, there is no place to dishonor our president. Whatever we may think of him, his politics, or any of the people around him, we have no right to speak ill of him. Thankfully, I've not seen it here, but I know that in other churches they've had struggles with Christians in the church who have had the profane signs in their front yard. And there's various reasons that's not at all right. But part of it is we're told clearly, Romans 13, 1 Peter chapter 1, 1 Peter chapter 2, that these governing authorities are appointed by God. And Peter says very clearly, honor the king. Give reverence to those in authority. Give the proper respect, even if we disagree, even if we in the church will and should clearly say, that's wrong. That's dead wrong. We can do so respectfully and graciously without defaming and demeaning the individual. The believer is responsible to honor, obey, and pray for all governmental authorities. We are obligated to this. And I would stress that last one, we must pray for those in authority. It's clearly the command of 1 Timothy chapter 2. Pray for them, for all men, that we may lead quiet and peaceable lives. And one of the reasons for that is 1 Timothy 2 tells us that God wants all to come to the knowledge of salvation. There is a gospel focus in our prayer for our government, that we are able to lead lives in which we are not hindered in the preaching of the gospel. When the commands of a government contradict the commands of God, the believer must obey God, but also with the realization that he's not removed from the legal consequences of such disobedience. And so I cannot not give the gospel. We must, as Christians, we must proclaim the gospel. And if proselytizing becomes outlawed in our nation, we must give the gospel. But that does not mean that we are thereby absolved from the consequences of our disobedience to the government. We still, as I've already alluded to, may go to prison or jail. We may still have fines levied against us. We may still suffer various losses. Again, tax exemption seems to be one of the easiest ways that I can see the government beginning to try to crack down on stuff and threatening to take away tax-exempt status. We are obligated to pay those penalties. Now, we can use all legal recourses. We live in a society where we have a large number of legal recourses. We can use every one of them to seek to address those issues, to seek to escape various penalties. But in the end, we are still obligated to pay the penalties that are levied on us and legitimately levied on us by the government. And so that the obedience to God does not mean that we're not going to spend the night in jail. Now, if God orchestrates a jailbreak, that's entirely up to Him. He's done that a few times. But that's His department. We just simply are submitting as much as we can to the governing authorities while remaining in full submission to God.